It's very nice to see so many people in these times where sometimes I see just few. I wanted to thank you, Amin, for this initiative to be able to be together and discuss these important topics. I think it's more relevant today maybe than ever. Um, so, uh, so in my presentation, I'm gonna combine a little bit my research and my personal experience. I'm gonna make a diagnose, and then I'm gonna tell what I feel could be a way out of this diagnose. So I did my PhD on the history of international law, particularly colonialism. And in my research, I study how the colonial powers justified appropriating and exploiting nature. And they did that through different legal tools, like the right to occupy private property. Behind all these legal tools, there was a justification, a rationale. And this justification was that the people that live in these lands, in Africa, in Australia, in North America and Latin America, were not able to exploit nature and create progress. Therefore, the colonialists had to take the land and the resources. So what came from these justifications and these legal tools were the creation of the colonies. And the colonies were structured, they were created and they developed through the exploitation of natural resources, where most people that inhabited those lands before the coming of the colonialists, they became labor. And many of them died in mines and plantations and so on. So my personal experience with these topics started when I lived in Honduras 1 year. And what I encountered in Honduras was pretty much the same of this structure I have described. So the land there was privatized, and there was a huge concentration of land. I remember one day I was going with somebody from my NGO, and we stopped a little bit to take some air. It was a long trip. And we stopped in this hill, and I could see a huge valley. And in all the valley, there was only African palm. So it was a very big plantation. And he told me, all these belongs to one person. And I was shocked. And he told me, yeah, and this is 1% of what this man owns in this country. So while few people had a lot of land, there were hundreds of thousands of peasants that didn't have a land to cultivate. There was also a lot of extraction of timber, deforestation, privatization of water and other natural resources. So that is what I saw in Honduras. And then I live in Mozambique. And when I arrived, the situation was a little bit different. People had land, they also fish. I was very lucky. I was living in front of a natural bay that was really, really beautiful. Some days we will see whales jumping. And that continued until they found natural gas, oil, and coal reserves. And some of them were the biggest in the world. And things started to change. People's land was seized. Many of the animals appeared dead because of they started the prospects with sounds and explosions. And yeah, and I started to witness similar things to what I saw in Honduras. So what was the tool that allowed to maintain this oppressive system? And I think I saw two tools. The first one was violence. So when I arrived to Honduras, the second day I came to the NGO where I was supposed to work, and I saw the lawyer I was gonna substitute. He was spending his time there, and I was gonna take his place. And I asked him, so why are you leaving? And he told me, because I received a death threat and I'm gonna have a child, so I want to keep safe. And of course, I was coming from Spain. I was very naive, and I was shocked. I was shocked. Why was he threatened? Why was his life threatened? Because he was investigating the murder of 3 peasants that worked for Chiquita Bananas, and they were leaders of a trade union. So that was the reason. A week later, I went to Tegucigalpa, to the capital, with some peasants. We were gonna meet some members of the government to tell them about their situation. And I was staying with a friend of a friend who happened to be a human rights lawyer. I didn't know that before I came to his house. And when I arrived to his house, he told me, well, don't be afraid, but today I was chased by a car with black windows because I went to sign a petition to open an investigation because of the assassination of another trade union leader. And of course, I was afraid. And so, you know, all this naivety that I had fell, collapsed, and was shattered in a week, where I saw with my own eyes how oppressive and violent the structure that kept this injustice was. So the second tool to keep this going, to keep these quasi-colonial entities in these now states, was the governments. So the government of Honduras and Mozambique, of course, allowed all this to happen. They knew, but they didn't care. And it was also all the other governments. So I remember going to Tegucigalpa, to the capital, and seeing people who was working with United Nations, people of the embassies. And I knew that they knew, so they had to know. I mean, I was a Spanish guy with not, I mean, I was in a very high political position, and I knew all these things. I knew who was threatened, who was the human rights activists, who were the landowners. I knew their names. So I knew that all the embassies of Spain and other countries knew, and they didn't do anything. So yeah, so this is what I saw there. And then Amin proposed me this exercise to compare that with Finland and Spain. So, you know, in one level, I could see very straight away that the life in Finland and Spain was different. There were affluent societies where this level of oppression and poverty that I witnessed was not there. Of course, there is poor people in Spain as well, but not to the level that I saw. And yet, if, you know, I'm also a therapist and a life coach. So if I take this experience and I look at these societies like Spain and Finland from another perspective, I see a lot of dissatisfaction. So millions of people that work very hard in jobs they don't like at all, and that many of them hate. So they give their time for corporations that, you know, they don't care much about these people. They can fire them if they need to. And many of these people, they spend a lot of time and energy there. So when they come home with the children, they are tired. So then I wonder, so what is common to these all countries? So what is common here? What is the common denominator that there are so many people that are unhappy? Some to a very, you know, with violence and extreme degree of poverty, and other people that were just dissatisfied. And I think is that they both work in a hierarchical system. So this is, I think, where most societies nowadays in the world operate. It's very hierarchical. So there is a pyramid where few people decides about the economy, the health, the liberties of millions of people. So then I was thinking, and I think, and this is where I'm going to be a little bit unconventional. So I think, why do humans suffer? And I think it's because we try to match two things that don't fit together. So I feel that human beings, we are horizontal beings. So we operate mainly through our hearts. Of course, we use our minds, and our minds are very encouraged and bombarded these days. But we are heart-centered human beings. So we are horizontal beings that are fit within a hierarchical system. And I think there is there a contradiction that creates so much suffering. So what I think can get us out of this trap, it's love. And it's coming back to the heart, which of course is very, I know it's quite unconventional to say. And I think when I was thinking about this, I thought this is gonna sound naive. I mean, that love is the solution. Sounds very simple and naive. And yet I'm gonna try to give you two proofs why this is not naive. So when I was at university working as a researcher in the faculty where I had my office, there were hundreds of talks every year. There were thousands of pages written by researchers. So if I would take that in the context of the whole world, every year there are millions of talks, millions of analysis, of pages of analysis, millions of policy recommendations. And you know, I've seen throughout the years that the condition of the people living in the countries where I was hasn't changed. And in Spain, there is much more inequality today than there was 10 years ago. So why would all these analysis and policies and recommendations and human rights discourses that are beautiful, and I think they are very useful, why haven't they changed reality? Because they all fall in the hierarchical system. So they will go to a book, they will go to a publisher, they will go to an organization, it will go to the United Nations, and it will go one step up, until it reaches a place in the pyramid where that discourse doesn't enter. And that is so very clear. It's very tough to realize and admit that this is so. And I think, of course, our government tried to have the appearance that is not. But I saw it very clearly in Honduras. So my glasses fell, and I could see that for the people at the top of the pyramid, they don't care.
2 more minutes.
How many, I mean?
Two.
Okay, so this is one proof. So the second proof is the social movements. So the people in Honduras and Mozambique taught me that there is another way, that, all these people, peasants, teachers, trade union leaders, they came together and they organized social movements. And they didn't do this because they respected human rights or because they had a very kind of complex analysis. They did that because they love their children. They love their communities. They love the territory where they live. So they did it out of love. And they created a movement that started to transform society in a way that the government couldn't stop because it went out of the system. It was the creation of something new. And going to my research and my thesis, I studied the pre-colonial populations in North America and South America and the Aboriginals, and they lived that way. They lived connected, and they didn't live connected because they had human rights or because they fought against poverty. It was because they lived from the heart, they lived from love to their communities, to their lands. Of course, the war is not so simple, it's not so black and white, and there were also wars. But there were many proofs that living together and going out of this vertical structure, hierarchical, where we live, I think is the way I see, because because within everything ends up falling in the same kind of system. And I end now, I have a quote. So I have this very beautiful book here with me. I'm going to show you. I don't know if you can see it.
Can you throw it backward? Then we can see, wow, amazing.
It's 365 thoughts of African masters.
Okay.
And by chance, some days ago, I found this quote that I think fits with what I'm trying to say. So it says, the ritual demands that we let our heart speak, as the logic of the mind is an obstacle for its success. And it's an African master who said it, so.
What's the name of the?
I can look for it. I don't know now, but I will.
Okay, yes. Yeah, in the question and answers. And you are just on time, and that was your 15 minutes. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dr. Manuel Jimenez. That was very powerful way to start the workshop. We stay on the first panel, that's web poverty, human rights, and development around the globe. And now we'll go to Pablo Ramos Cruz, who's joining us all the way from Puerto Rico. So Pablo will be talking about when colonialism, disaster, and capitalism collide, corruption, tax, having poverty, and the forgotten citizens of Puerto Rico. So Pablo, over to you.
Can you all see this?
We don't see you. Yes, now we can see you. And by the way, it's not possible to share your slides. Yes.
Okay, can you see it now, the slides? George, I did this presentation for 15 minutes, yes. Not 10.
Yes, it's
okay, so I'm gonna try. So first off, thank you all for this opportunity. My name is Pablo. I'm from Puerto Rico, even though I'm doing my PhD in social work in York University in Toronto, Canada. I call my presentation When Colonialism, Disaster, and Capitalism Collides, Corruption, Tax Haven, Poverty, and the Forgotten Citizens of Puerto Rico. I'm gonna show you a quick video that summarizes the presentation.
Visit Puerto Rico, America's favorite colony, territory. The Caribbean island famous for its tropical beaches, historic icons, breathtaking scenery, but mostly for... Fortunately, however, few know about the real Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States since 1898, when we seized it from the Spanish, who in turn stole it from the Taino, which makes Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens, well, second-class citizens, because despite fighting in every one of our wars, they still can't vote for president and have no representation in Congress. In other words, U.S. citizens who have fuck all say in the laws the U.S. government makes for them. And to bring you the ultimate colonial experience, we've made a few over the years, like the gag law, which banned their flag and brutally suppressed independence movements, bombing the crap out of Vieques for 60 years, conducting birth control experiments on Puerto Rican women, and of course, the Jones Act, which enforced a U.S. corporate monopoly that crippled local industry and, along with other crap, created shit tons of debt. Debt which Wall Street vulture funds bought up like blood-sucking chupacabras. And when Puerto Ricans could no longer pay back that debt, we made a new law. No, not to ease poverty and unemployment, but to impose austerity measures, cutting pensions and the minimum wage, cutting university funding, closing down schools and hospitals. Today, many Puerto Ricans are fleeing the island from this unholy shit show we created, which of course gives rich gringos the chance to move in and buy up tropical beaches at a discount. Don't miss our special neo-colonial tax holiday package. And you too can be a pirate of the Caribbean, sipping pina colada with chupacabras, while Puerto Ricans get kicked out of their homes. Visit Puerto Rico, the island you never even knew we were colonizing the shit out of. Authorized by the Department for the War and Territories. Also responsible for bullshit in American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands, North Mariana, and Guam.
Okay, so I think someone is not mute. Can everyone be mute?
Can someone mute?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, now, so a quick overview. I don't know if all of you know it. I'm going to leave a lot of things out. So it's in a nutshell. Puerto Rico, I think, okay, here. So Puerto Rico is a colony from ever. We never have been free. Our first was from Spain, then from the US from 1898. But they gave us the US citizenship during the First War in the 1917. Even though we were a territory, we were not citizens. And they give it to us so we can be part of the Selective Service Draft Lottery, right? We have participated in all the wars since then with the US. There are studies that talks about the overrepresentation of Puerto Ricans in the wars, how we are mostly the front lines during US wars. But it was around the 50s, specifically the 52, that US create what we call the Commonwealth, right? Because it was a big pressure from the UN that there should not be any more colonies. They create this like Commonwealth territory so that what it gives us is like an internal local government. However, that government is subordinated to the US law. So whatever decision the US does applies to us, right? And it is also attached that we cannot make any relation with other countries, right? Even though our neighbors, right? Because Puerto Rico is in the Caribbean, we have all the small islands, but also we have Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and Cuba are our neighbors. And we cannot make any international relation with them, right? At the same time, we cannot vote for the president, and we don't have representation in the US Congress. So we don't have voice or vote in any decision that are made in the US that affect Puerto Rico, right? So they can make any decision about Puerto Rico, and we don't have no one there with vote or voice to go to say something on our own behalf. Also, we are prohibited of buy or sell from other countries that requires shipping companies. So all the shippings that come to Puerto Rico have to go first to the US. What this does is two things. First is delay things. So in Puerto Rico, we receive a lot of expired things, right? Because they can come from another country, they have to come first to US, and then they have to come to Puerto Rico. So we have like food and family. Sorry, I think Toma is not on mute. We have food and medicine that is expired sometimes. And the other thing is that we have to pay the extra costs because every time you go to a new ship is new money. So instead of going directly here, they have to go to the US first, and that prices are big higher. in a nutshell, for the economic history, Puerto Rico at the beginning was like a treasure won in a war against Spain. And if they specifically want us because of the geographic location near to Panama's Canal, and because we're very close to, like, it was very strategic in the sense for military convenience, right? But then after the Cold War started slowing down, the United States began to prioritize Puerto Rico for more like a task heavy. So in the 70s was a big change in laws to make tax exemption for large corporations. Also, there was a lot of environmental regulation, and there was a specifically economics policy to promote foreign industry to come to the island, right? These fiscal changes make Puerto Rico like a leading economy in the Caribbean. It was still like an example, but it's because the GDP was growing, right? But that do not mean that it was, you can see that redistribution, where you can see there's Puerto Rico have a lot of money, but not the Puerto Ricans that have that money, right? It can be a rich country, but not for the people. So this comes together with the government making a lot of spending. And I'm going to talk about the debt. So what happened was that for 15 years, we have been in crisis. 2006, we have not come out from the economic crisis. This combination of 30 years of like granting multi-dollar exception to foreign corporation, attached to government continuing the extravagant spending and corruption, those things together was like a bomb. One of the things is that after the crisis, the next governments have been continuing to do the same thing, right? Have not been a change. So the 2006 crisis was not something that stopped them. They continued the same policies, right? So for give you a sample, regarding the debt, if a person buy one of the government supposedly high risk bonds, they will get it and an interest of almost $1,000. The government has to pay them back 1,000% of interest. That's how bad it was, right? And the thing is that our constitution says that we cannot make a debt higher than 1% of our budget, but that has not been investigated. How much, what part of that debt was illegal, right? Unconstitutional. And no one from the US wants us to investigate that. Our government don't want to investigate that. So we're paying basically a lot of money that we don't know is illegal or unconstitutional. So what happened was that the Puerto Rican government went to the Obama administration. It was not Trump, it was Obama, trying to declare bankruptcy for a second, and a second option, try to negotiate restructuring the debt with international organizations. So they're like, I cannot bankruptcy with your laws, or if I can go to an international organization to try to restructure my debt. The US was like, nope, you are a colony. You cannot do both. Because you are a colony, you cannot go to any international mechanism to try to negotiate your debt. And because you're not a state, you cannot use our American bankruptcy law, right? So the solution for the Obama administration was like, we're going to give you a very undemocratic neoliberal fiscal control board with absolute power that will seek to guarantee the payment of the debt. So at any cost. So Puerto Rican is going to pay that debt. I don't care if you don't eat. I don't care if you're homeless. I don't care if you lose education or health. You have to pay that debt. I mean, we're not going to check how much is illegal or unconstitutional. So Puerto Rico has been assigned this fiscal board with no voice, a vote, or who are those members. So that board goes even above our government, above a governor, above the Supreme Court, or above the legislator in Puerto Rico. So the imposition of this control board made the life of the people in Puerto Rico more precarious, right? Because they were prioritizing the payment of that debt above the social right and collective welfare of the people in the island. So that then hit Maria, right? So we're going through all this, and then the Hurricane Maria came. I think most of you have heard about it. Almost 3,000 people died, and we got like 40 billion in damages, right? So this is like the cherry inside, like in top of the sundae. It was super devastating. There was like videos. I don't have time for that, but like, it was super, super bad. And then 1 year after, 1.5 years after, an earthquake. Over 200 millions in damage, and even schools were like very, very demolished. Right? There's people are living in the streets because of the earthquake. Right? So what happens? Naomi Klein is the author of this concept. It's called disaster capitalism. This happened in a lot of countries, especially the racialized country, right? Or racialized city, towns. What happened was, as soon as natural disasters happen in your country, be aware that the people from the north are going down, right? Like white people from the north are going to come to your country and they're going to try to make money. They know this how it works, right? So what happened as soon the hurricane came and earthquake, after earthquake also, those in American corporation come to seek control of the federal agencies, right? Aids, the money, right? So they come here, they're like, I will manage the money. Like, give me that proposal for me, so I can give that money. So they make millions of dollars, and we do not receive the money, right? We have a lot of like examples around that, right? A very sad example of how corporation came to to Puerto Rico, come from the US to Puerto Rico, and they get in charge of those aids, and they're in charge of making the recovery of the natural disaster. Also, is another very group of millionaires come to to those countries after disaster capitalism, because they go to two. They come to the government to say, like, you need to privatize school, right? You need to privatize housing. You need to privatize health services. You need to privatize natural resources. We are the best one to manage those services, right? So what is disaster capitalism? What it does is they take advantage of the people who are in shock, right? The people are in crisis. There are like Puerto Rico are basically burying their families in the backyard, right? They don't have power for 1 year. They don't have electricity, internet. They can't have food, like the ones that you need for the refrigeration, right? You have to eat something that do not perish. And the government is like selling everything, privatizing everything, right? So that is how it works, right? So we have a sample, the most recent ones, we have Logan Paul, who's a YouTuber. He wants to go to Puerto Rico basically as at heaven. And we also have Brooke Pierce, that he thinks that Puerto Rico is can be like a utopia for cryptocurrency, right? So we have a lot of US people that come to Puerto Rico because they think, they think they can, they can decide what is the best solution for Puerto Rico, right? It's a very big drama that happened. We saw in a chat of the governor, one of the members of the cabinet was having a conversation with one of the millionaires, and he wrote this. He said, I saw the future. It's a one before there are no Puerto Ricans, right? So they're selling the country. They're kicking us from here, right? So for finish, my conclusions to make the connection with the topic, we need to decolonize Puerto Rico. This is obviously, right? That's the struggle that we need to do. But also we have to connect it to human rights, right? We have a very culture different from the US. Even the Constitution, the US block our Constitution and take out things that we have, like right to education, right to housing, right for social services, right for health. So we have those in the Constitution. The US taking it out, right? And put on like freedom of speech, and you can have an arm and you can kill someone. So that is the difference of like, what are the priorities, right? And Puerto Rican, what a country that social rights and human rights are a priority. And the second thing is that after colonization, we have to be careful that we don't change the US for another country in the global north that have this type of relationship with us, right? We have to be very careful about what's going to be our role in being in the South in global capitalism. Yeah, that's it. Folk resilience and discourse, Puerto Rico don't need to be praised for keeping and recovering from oppression and adversity. What we need is more allies in our fight for freedom. And thank you all.
Thank you so much, Pablo. And that brings us to the end of panel 1. And I will now open the floor for questions and answers. So there's 15 minutes. You can either send your questions as chats or you can ask directly. You can unmute your audio and video and ask directly, or you can send as chat. So, and the questions are for Manuel and Pablo. So if you have questions, the floor is yours. Anyone is welcome.
I'll ask a question to Pablo. Do you think that with the new administration in the US that there'll be kind of any difference? Because Biden seems to be jumping on a lot of, the social movements that are on social media and throughout like communities. So do you think that, the new administration will take any notice for what's happening in Puerto Rico?
So the thing is that there's only two options, right? It's like we be a state or we be an independent country. If we be an independent country, we cannot be like this place that they can use for profits, right? So they will lose that. And we don't see that the US is gonna be willing, like by their self, right? To giving ourselves up, right? Like we're gonna give you freedom, right? And that would not happen. It have to happen like through international pressure. We have been going every year to the United Nations, and all the countries have signed the petition to the colonization of the Puerto Rico, except the US. So the US have never, no matter the administration, not Trump, of course, not Trump, but neither Obama or Clinton or any of the other ones, right? So they always say like Puerto Rico's colonial situation is resolved. We give them a Commonwealth, right? So they have a place that they can take bodies. They have a place they can make a profits, and they have a place of like can have like a military convenience. In the side of statehood, what it means that first of all, from the 5 territories that they have a Supreme Court decision that we are not in the road to be a state. That was a requirement before making a territorial state, is that from the very beginning is part of the union, right? So we were not part of so that is something that have to change. And the second thing is that making us a state means that we have as Puerto Rican, and they are being very clear. US says like, we are not multi-country, we are one country. So if you want to be part of the US, you have to not being Puerto Rican. You have to stop being Puerto Rican, right? So that includes your culture, that includes your language, and that includes idiosyncrasy, right? So you have to be one. You cannot be going around the country saying you're from Puerto Rico. You have to now start saying you're from the US. And that part of that assimilation process, I don't think they feel us that we're gonna be like them. So we're in this, I think they're in the perfect position for them. I don't see it's gonna change from their side in a sense of like, I don't think they're gonna give another option. I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah, thank you.
Avery, was that clear?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Okay, good. So some other questions for Manuel?
Yeah.
Chilenye.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pablo, for those, for the historical facts that you provided. I've learned a lot about Puerto Rico. One of the questions I have is, how does Puerto Rico sustain itself financially? Does it depend solely on the US, or does it receive direct aid from other countries and development institutions?
Okay, so yeah, I forgot that I saw it today. I was like, oh, I forgot that. So how it worked was in the beginning was a monoculture. What it means is that the US make Puerto Rico to do agriculture from one single food. So the US decided what was the one they want to transport, right? So at the beginning it was a country around agriculture, but it was only one. So it was like, you're gonna focus in tobacco now. You're gonna focus now in sugar. You're gonna focus now in bananas. You're gonna focus, right? So they make us one sole economic production for the US. That was the first phase. Then the second phase, when industrialization came, we are fully industrial in a sense that we are here for those companies that don't want to have to pay taxes, right? So Puerto Ricans, basically the works that we can find is like services for tourism, or we can work for one of those corporations that they pay us very bad. They don't pay us US salary, right? So basically Puerto Rico is full of US corporations that don't want to pay local or federal taxes, like I was saying, a tax heaven. So we have a lot of like works around working for those corporation or working for tourism, like hotels or taxi or servicing restaurants and stuff like that. So those are the big two, right? So they have a place close to home because it's like 3 hours in a plane. They can have free taxes if you live more than 6 months, right? So the government is like, come here, make your companies, your corporations.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question for Manuel. So Manuel, where do you see the future of Mozambique and Honduras, let me say in 10 years time, in terms of economic development? You have to unmute your microphone, sorry.
Yes. So I think it depends. It depends a lot on what happens at the global level and at the political level. So these countries have been occupying a position in the world economy, basically as places where natural resources can be extracted at the cost of the lives of the population. And I don't think that is going to change unless the global climate and structure, these structures that I talk about, change. And personally, I think it's going to change. I have the feeling that all these movements that has been lately in all the countries are, because it has to be this dimension of change. I don't think a change of political party. I don't think a change is still in a vertical hierarchical society. There needs to be a very big transformation of the world as a whole. And I feel this is happening. I think we're connecting more, one with another directly, not through the mediation of governments or religious leaders, no, directly. So personally, I think there is a beautiful future for all these countries and people. I think also they have initiated many of these changes themselves with the social movements. So they are already transforming the lives of millions of people. They're occupying land. They have stopped the privatization of resources in many cases. So I feel personally, but this is just a feeling, that these old structures want to die, that we human beings want something new, something different. And I think it's slowly coming. But let's see what happens. It depends on all of us. This is what I can say. It depends on all of us, our actions. Yeah. So.
And Pablo, if I can ask the same question to you for Puerto Rico. You have to unmute your microphone also, sorry.
All right, Zoom. So as I was saying, we are the forgotten citizens, right? Like, for example, when the hurricane came, President Trump was like, I'm going to Puerto Rico to talk to the president, right? And the media was like, you are the president. So the US is not even the government. It's not even care about the citizens in Puerto Rico, right? That is, do not give us nothing besides we can travel to the country. So I think our struggle, it is economically, but also culturally. If we wanna, like I was saying, okay, so the thing is, geographically, we're in the middle of Venezuela and Cuba. So US is super nervous that we are too socialist, right? Because of culturally, we care for the collective. Our policy usually are like health systems for people, education for the people, housing for the people, right? So there's a big tension here of how we can decolonize the country in a Puerto Rican way, in a way that we don't want to be a rich country. We're not interested in that, right? We want freedom, we want equality, and we want the well-being of the people who live here. And that is a big, I think that is a difficult under global capitalism. I'm worried about leaving the US, right? Woohoo! And then go inside this global north, global south, global capitalism that would not benefit anyone. So I think that has to be, like Manuel was saying, has to be a united forces of those people that believe in collective well-being, trying to see the future in a more equity way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question, and I must say that those presenting can also ask questions. It's allowed. So we have time for one more question for the first panel.
I have one question.
Yes.
So my question is for Manuel. Thank you for the talk, Manuel. And my question is connected to when you said that there are a lot of research at the university level, at the academic level, and they go up to the pyramid, but there is at a certain point that it doesn't reach the next level of the pyramid, the higher level of the pyramid. And actually there has been a lot of debate about how academia can communicate with the policymaker and how policymaker can understand the research of academics. So what would you suggest? What would be, what can help the academic to be heard or understood by the higher level of the pyramid? Thank you.
Thank you, Corina. So, and when I talk about that all these analyses and recommendations, they end up that way. I also was thinking about international organizations and development agencies. I think it happens the same there because they have very good analysis. And so for me, this is why what I propose is a change, is a structural change, or what I feel is, because as long as this pyramid is there, and to me, the people that are at the very top, that they are beyond the academia. So I think there could be many ways in which this can be improved at the level of the academia, maybe the Finnish government, but then the Finnish government is going to travel to Brussels. And the people that travel to Brussels, many of them are going to follow what they say in Davos. And what the people in Davos many times follow what they say in, there's this other group, Bilderberg, that many people don't even know it exists. So there is these very super rich billionaires, people who control the media, meeting together and deciding really big things. So, in that structure, I think, that there is no way. This is why, for me, the way would be that, for example, you find something in your research, and I know this is something you do, Corina, because I know you start acting, you start gathering with people, and you start changing already, not waiting for what the government is going to think or say, because in my estimation and my experience has shown me that at some point they don't care. So, you will go up many levels and people still care. They are very humane. But at some point, what I saw in Honduras, they don't really care about any of that. They will listen, they will say yes, but then they will do, what is in their interests. And yet, I know that many people in the academia and many people in the government would really listen to that and sincerely want to change. But, this will go to another super structure, maybe the EU, maybe Davos, and there are 100 people and they have very clear what they want. So, yeah.
Okay, it's time, but there's one more question for both speakers. It was sent to chat by one of our participants, and the question reads: could you mention some tools of the people against colonial practices that help maintaining cultural and economic sustainability? That is for both presenters. So Manuel, you can just start.
So there has been many tools. So creating alternative economies, you know, people producing locally, producing ecologically, and selling also locally. So all my advice go in the way of disentangling from these hierarchical structures and creating something different. I think, for example, I think it's in Porto Alegre in Brazil, there is this, I don't remember what is, this meeting of all the social movements of the world. And just the fact that people talk between them, communities that listen to each other, many people that are going to nature, to live in nature. So there are many tools, and there has always been there. There are many people who, you know, many human rights activists who listen to the victims of this, of oppression, who really help them healing. So there are a lot of tools, and these tools have worked. I think it's very important also to remember how powerful we are as people. And yeah, so this is the ones that come to my mind, you know, being together, alternative economies, the healing, you know, and the human rights lawyers. Also, you can use this structure until some point. So many, throughout colonialism, many people use the tribunals, and some of them, you know, they were meaningful. So there are also all these possibilities, and this is what comes to my mind quickly without having much time.
And then Pablo, if in 2 minutes you can also say something on the same question.
Yeah. So something, I don't know, I don't have time for it right in the presentation, but something that happened was that a big chat was exposed to everyone and from the governor. So the governor with the main actors of the government was exposed that chat and have a lot of like the corruption behind, right? And that put people furious. So the learning process of it is, okay, so at the end, the Puerto Rican kick out the governor. The governor was, I say the word renunciar, how do you say it? Withdraw from the position. So what we learned through the process, I think that social movements are important, but are not unique. The more diverse that can be, the more powerful they want to be. So what happened with us was that people were so furious, but they don't see themselves on fighting on the streets, right? So the fighting on the street was happening, but there was other ways of pronunciation. For example, there was like single mothers at 8 p.m. they were banging their casseroles. There was like old ladies in the government office turning down the governor photos. There was like people dancing salsa and reggaeton in Old San Juan, and then talking about it and having like group conversation around it, right? So there was like people in motorcycles, like hundreds motorcycles, and they let's talk about this, what is happening, right? So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes we know the power of social movement, but sometimes we want to put everyone in the one of the streets and like, let's do a big manifestation. While in our case, what it worked was like leave everyone from their own space to fight for how the way they think, it was the way they can pronounce themselves. And it was beautiful. Same people doing yoga, and then other ones doing painting, and other one doing arts, right? So it was super live, and it was a learning experience of how we can include people that don't feel that they don't see themselves like fighting in the street and manifestation, right? The most classical one. But yeah, that was something that we learned. I think we can share that for other struggles.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Thank you so much, Manuel. That was a wonderful panel and a great way to...
May I have one last minute? Because
yes.
Now when Pablo was talking, something came to me.
Okay.
And you know, it was very beautiful what he said. And you know, one way is to create the world you want to live already now. So doing yoga, painting, singing, whatever it is that you have inside, you know, sharing that helps. And the other one, I think, is truth. So if I look throughout history, what, you know, the people that resisted colonialism, the movements nowadays. What they bring is the truth, because this hierarchical system needs to lie. You know, it needs to pretend, it needs to cloak things so we don't see. So, for example, when Corina was mentioning about the research at university, when you write your own research, there is a truth there that is very important to share. So I didn't want to be interpreted to say that is meaningless. What I said is that these structures don't care about that, but other people will read your research. So it's very meaningful. And so the truth, I think, is very important. And I think is what has been coming through WikiLeaks, you know, through alternative people that are bringing, this is happening. So we're more aware of the world we live in. So this is one, to see what is the problem, really see it clearly. And the other is start living from who we are, you know, from within, sharing all this beauty, as Pablo said, that I completely agree with him. It's not about only protest or no, it's much more than that, much deeper. So thank you, Pablo.
Yes. Yeah, very wonderful presentations. Actually, I got a text message from one of the participants who says, I'm enjoying the influx of information. So it shows how beautiful you have presented. And I will also say that we have and also another guest presenter. He was not on the program, but he decided to join us from Cameroon. So so that's Dr. Babila Sama. He will be presenting later in the day. So, but from Puerto Rico and Honduras and Mozambique, we now go to London, to the UK. We have that's panel 2, and that's on policies and implications for poverty and people's rights. And we'll start with Dr. Chilenye Nwapi, who is an expert at the Commonwealth of Nations in London, and he's an expert on extractive sector governance, policy, and regulation. And he'll be presenting on the structural development goals in our times. So over to you, Dr. Chilenye. And kindly unmute your microphone.
And I would like to share my screen.
Yes, you can share. It's not possible.
Yeah. Are you seeing it?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Thank you very much, Amin, for inviting me to join this group of experts to discuss on one of the most important issues of our time, poverty and human rights. It's something that continues to plague humanity, and the developing countries have been worse up for it. And so I'll be focusing on the SDGs, talk about some of the stakes, and then the challenges, and make some recommendations on the way forward to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I have 15 minutes, so I will try my best to keep within the time, perhaps skip 1 or 2 slides, although I don't have many slides. The Sustainable Development Goals were built around the concept of sustainable development, which, although it defies a universally agreed upon definition, there is a definition that is considered by most scholars as the most popular and the most comprehensive. And that was the definition provided in the 1987 Brundtland Reports, which defines the concept as development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. There have been a lot of criticism around this definition, whether it is comprehensive enough, whether it contains all the elements of sustainable development. But at least for now, it is agreed that it is the one that is most acceptable. Now, within this definition, a number of issues need to be highlighted. One of them is the need to limit the activities we carry out in the process of development, to limit them to the carrying capacity of the earth, because the earth has only so much that it can carry at each point in time. And also to manage our natural resources in a way that serves both the demands of the present time as well as the needs of future generations. What constitutes the needs of future generations is something that is open to question, whether we can know with certainty what future generations need, or whether we can simply make a guesswork But at least it's important for us to think about it. And in the process of thinking about it, we'll be able to at least make some compromise, reserve some resources that future generations will use to meet their own needs. The other important aspect of the definition is the idea of intra and intergenerational equity. Intra equity within the same generation, for instance, men and women, the young and the old, and also the aged, and also equity within within geographies, whether it is Africa, whether it's global north and global south. So it's very important. And then intergenerational equity has to do with today and tomorrow. Yeah. And then the other aspect of sustainable development that has been highlighted very strongly, especially within the business sector, is the triple bottom line, which is the economic component of sustainable development, the environmental component, and the social component. And so the triple bottom line emphasizes the need for these three components of sustainable development to come together. And so all the activities that we carry out in the process of development should serve these three components, so that we cannot, for instance, sacrifice economic development for environmental protection. There has to be a way to reach a compromise so that all these needs can be met. Now, coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were established in or adopted in 2015. The goals are 17 in number, which have been summarized in the picture that you are seeing. Because this workshop is based mainly on poverty, so I'm more interested in emphasizing the poverty aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals. But there's need to know that all of these goals are intertwined. You cannot achieve one without the other. For instance, you cannot achieve poverty, which is, you cannot achieve eradication of poverty, which is goal 1, without, for instance, working also to achieve gender equality, which is goal 5, because there are lots of gender issues around poverty. And it's, I think, if we look at the statistics, women suffer disproportionately when it comes to poverty issues in the rural areas, in all sectors. They have been left out in the process of development over centuries. And so all of them are intertwined. You can't talk about eradicating poverty without addressing issues of climate change, without addressing issues of decent work and economic growth, which is goal 8, without addressing issues of hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, clean water and sanitation. So all of them are intertwined. And one of the goals that has garnered global attention more recently is the need for partnerships to achieve the goals, which is goal 17 rather. And so goal 17 seeks to gather all the efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a question of building partnerships at all levels, across geographies, within a country, across gender and every other aspect of our society, public-private partnerships and all that. One of the key things about the Sustainable Development Goals is their universal relevance. Sustainable development issues exist in all countries, whether the rich or the poor. And so the SDGs represent a kind of common vision of progress, which all members of the United Nations adopted in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect our earth, and ensure that all people around the world enjoy peace and prosperity by the year 2030. And so the Sustainable Development Goals have a time-based goal to see whether all of these things can be achieved by the year 2030. Of course, the world is already off track in meeting these goals in 2030, and that is not uncommon. Even the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, a lot of progress was made, but the world was already also off track in achieving those goals. And so the Sustainable Development Goals have what I call a 4-part notion of universality. One of them is recognition of principles, standards, and values that are enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goals. The other one is the interconnectedness of national and global development challenges. So the challenges that countries face within their geography are interconnected with the challenges faced globally in other countries. The other one is that sustainable development issues exist in all countries. There's poverty in every country. There's lack of education in every country. Of course, some countries are faring a lot better than others, but these problems still exist, whether it is here in the UK, whether it is in the United States and Canada, in Australia, in Finland, anywhere. So these issues are universal. The last one is universal commitment to leaving no one behind. And so it kind of unifies the intentions of the global community of all countries to commit, to join efforts together to make sure that no one is left behind, both at the national level, at the local level, and at the global level. And so this fourth component has to do with eradicating inequality, because as long as there is still inequality, some people have been left behind. That's exactly what it translates to. So I will be focusing on poverty because that is the goal that is most relevant to this conference. If you look at the screen, you would see some of the pictures that provide some statistics regarding poverty. One of them is that before COVID-19, the world was already off track to end poverty by 2030. So with or without COVID-19, we were already off track. But COVID-19 has made it even worse, that now it has become impossible, not practically impossible, but absolutely impossible to eradicate poverty by 2030. And it's not just poverty it's not just eradicating poverty that COVID-19 has affected, it has also affected the achievement of the other sustainable development goals. Now, there are the sustainable development goals on poverty. I try to find some very interesting statistics about poverty around the world today. One of them is that global extreme poverty rate fell to 9.2% in 2017 from 10.1% in 2015. So there has been some progress that has been made over the years. And this progress wasn't made only from 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, but they have been made even during the time of the Millennium Development Goals. So some progress has been made, except that since the end of 2019, when the COVID-19 pandemic began, a lot of drawback has been experienced. At higher poverty lines, it is said that 24.1% of the world lived on less than $3.2 per day. It's even much worse in some parts of the world, in Africa, where it is even said that about more than 80% live in less than $1.25 per day. And you can imagine that. And when we realize that there are people who make millions of dollars per day, and it gives us a clear picture of what inequality is and the level of inequality that we have around the world. Not even to talk about the ones at the national level, because it is also very prominent there. Now, among the poor, it is said that half of the poor are children, which is something that is very unfortunate, because the adults have a responsibility over the children. And so if half of the poor are children, one can even assume that the parents of these children are also poor, because they are the ones taking care of them. The children, most of them at least, they are not able to earn their own living, so they depend on their parents. If half of them are poor, then of course it gives us a picture of how their parents are faring. The other fantastic information around that is the place of women, who represent a majority of the poor in most regions of the world. And so that is why I try to emphasize the need for universal commitments to leave no one behind in the fight against poverty. The Sustainable Development Goals don't just establish these goals, they also establish targets and also indicators. 2
more minutes.
How many?
2.
2 minutes, okay. Let me skip the targets, but the goal is to have a world where extreme poverty is eradicated by the year 2030, and extreme poverty is defined as living on less than $1.25 a day. In Africa, this is the case, more than 80% of the population. So that means that they live in extreme poverty. Some of the things at stake in the sustainable development discussion include the existential threats, especially occasioned by climate change. Lives are at stake. Child mortality, women maternal mortality, and general mortality rates in most parts of the world are very low, especially in developing countries. And then crimes and conflicts. The lack of achievement of the sustainable development goals feeds criminals. I mean, it's an incentive for many people to engage in crimes. Poverty is associated with criminality and conflicts as well. And then the inequality that exists at the global level, at the national level, at the local level. It in itself is a huge problem that needs to be addressed. Now, there are a number of challenges to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. One of them is there are too many competing interests. Corporations have their own interests. The Global North have their own interests. Global South have their own interests. Not that, for instance, the interests of the Global North are uniform, but to an extent, they are different from those of the Global South. And it makes it difficult for people for the world to come together to find innovative solutions and take action to implement them. The other one is local level implementation capacity. The Sustainable Development Goals were meant to be achieved at the local level. And most of the actions to be taken to achieve them are to be taken at the local level. But many local governments do not have the capacity to implement them. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the finances. And so financing is also very important. The other one is accountability of responsible stakeholders. Of course, they are chiefly governments, but there are also private actors like transnational corporations who are not being held accountable for the abuses they commit in the countries, especially in countries with weak governance, where they operate. And then the issue of corruption, which has also been complicated by the pandemic. Global extreme poverty was expected to rise in 2020 for the first time, or rather, global extreme poverty is expected to rise in 2020 for the first time in over 20 years due to COVID-19. And so global extreme poverty was going low until COVID-19 came on board and everything went the other direction. There are a number of recommendations that I have proposed. One of them is public-private partnerships. The corporations and other private actors need to work together with the government because there's a lot of financing needed. There's a lot of knowledge generation that the governments alone cannot fund. They don't have the capacity. And then the other important recommendation I have made is that investments in development cooperation need to be targeted so that they will reach the places where they are needed the most. Public participation, allow the people to be affected by a project to contribute to decisions around how the project is to be undertaken. Strengthen the capacity of local stakeholders to implement SDGs. The other one is transparency, especially transparency around how development finance is to be utilized by the government or by other actors responsible for that. There's need for transparency about how decisions are made, because transparency invokes public confidence in the process, and that confidence is important. The other one is investments in capacity building, especially of local actors, to enable them to acquire the skill sets that are needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And last but not least, there is need for a whole of government approach, as well as a whole of society approach to the achievement of sustainable development. This requires a lot of coordination to make sure that all the government stakeholders, all the societal actors, whether it's corporations, NGOs, government officials, and local communities, that their activities are coordinated, because that lack of coordination has been a problem, and it's one that exists in our countries, of course, more pronounced in other countries. Sorry, Amina, I've taken a couple of minutes extra, but that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're mute?
Yeah, thank you so much for this compact and beautiful presentation. I'm very sure lots of questions will be coming your way. So, but before that, I will call on the second presenter in the panel. That is Ms. Avery Benton, also from London, King's College London, to she'll be presenting on a tale of two protests in the age of human rights, the Capitol riots and BLM, that's Black Lives Matter discourse. So Avery, the floor is yours.
Hi. I'm the only one who's not a doctor or a doctoral candidate, but I'll be there someday, so that's fine. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, can everyone see it? To start out, I'm originally from America, but I've been studying in London for the past 5 years now. So basically what I'm going to do is run through the two most recent social movements that have been going through the US, which is basically white nationalism and the Black Lives Matter movement. So to start off with the most recent event in the United States is the attempt on the Capitol, which some people have been calling it coup, some people have been calling it insurgency, some people have been calling it riots. So basically the idea behind the Capitol riots stems from a much larger systemic issue. So when people stormed the Capitol building, they did so at least to a lot of people's belief that it was from Trump's rhetoric for refusing to concede the election and basically threatening the democracy of the United States, which I guess is questionable in itself. But basically, like, the point that the Capitol riots make in terms of the social kind of climate of the US right now is that while we have strong social movements to try and reclaim some minority populations' rights, people are moving towards a more equal kind of society and a social context, but at the same time there's a lot of backlash behind that. And so the last bullet point on the slide, the kind of like rise of alt-America. So basically the kind of unchecked spread of white supremacist ideology that's been happening in the US kind of offers a counter to the other movement that's currently happening in the US, which is the Black Lives Matter movement. So there was a lot of protests, this past summer. And I think the most striking difference is the difference in the organization and the execution of social protest. So Black Lives Matter movements, there was, first of all, a much larger response to the Black Lives Matter movement than there were to the Capitol riots. And a huge difference is also in the difference between the peacefulness and the violence that we see when we compare these two social events. People who participated in the Black Lives Matter movement are highlighting injustices, that are systemic, that are nationwide, and it crosses the spectrum of race, socioeconomics, multiple different social contexts for people, versus the people who participated in the Capitol riots are usually white, ascribing to a white nationalist kind of anti-Semitic, basically like equality sort of ideology, which is in historical contrast to what the BLM movement has been highlighting since this past summer and beforehand, because I think that it's also important to note that these human rights abuses, especially for the Black community, have been happening for generations upon generations, whereas the grievances that white nationalists feel are against them are more recent developments, only since like the 1950s. So it's essentially equality versus a narrower view of the nation state. So this also results in different policies, because while the two populations of these two movements are very different in terms of race, socioeconomic class, political affiliation, there's a lot of differences in terms of their demographics, but there's also a huge policy response that differentiates how America is viewing these social movements, if that makes sense. I guess to illustrate, the first part would be the police response. So when the BLM movements were happening over the summer, I'm sure people have seen, there's a picture from Richmond with like the tanks and, you know, the smoke flares and such, is basically the police attacked BLM marchers, but also, you know, the entire situation of Seattle, where the police were basically attacking peaceful protesters, and it turned into kind of a antagonist kind of movement between the two. And then versus the police response when people stormed the Capitol, which is, you know, obviously the sanctioned hall of government, and there was basically no police response. And what's also really interesting is the heroization of the police officer who saved some senators. I believe it was Mitt Romney. He saved from a bunch of protesters. So we have the lauding of a police officer in the situation of the Capitol insurgency, yet there wasn't actually a huge police response to essentially keep these people out of the building versus the BLM protests when, you know, people were peacefully protesting, or even if they weren't peacefully protesting, you know, they're using tanks, they're using basically military grade weapons against civilians who are exercising their constitutional right and legal right to, you know, obviously gather and express their social grievances. And also a difference is shown in the media versus basically the right-wing media, and to a lesser extent the mainstream media, the way that they report on the BLM basically like marches versus the way that the Capitol was treated. The Capitol incident was treated as more of an issue related directly to Trump, whereas BLM was kind of seen as an extension of a larger problem. But the two different sides, because there's a lot of things that talk about people's echo chambers. So it really depends on which kind of news source you're actually reading, because some news sources would lean super towards vilifying either BLM leaders or the movement, or they'd lean super towards vilifying the Capitol riots and the attack on the Capitol. So there's essentially a difference in opinion that splits right down the line between how people view which one is correct, which one is incorrect. There's a lot of criticism on the BLM movement for the rioters in terms of how they would destroy property, which actually weren't usually connected with the movement, versus there's almost no indignation or criticism of the people who stormed the Capitol in terms of the damage that, you know, they physically wrought on the Capitol building, but also on the the domestic institution of democracy. And a tangible policy difference between BLM and the Capitol riots would be the new Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2021, which has been criticized as basically being kind of a late coming anti-terrorism bill. Some people say that, you know, it should have been introduced a while ago, and its intentions are stated to combat domestic terrorism, which would, you know, obviously give more surveillance and police powers. But a lot of social critics and media, you know, social protesters are criticizing the move as basically like a late response to be able to police BLM and other minority movements, so like other indigenous movements, you know, in the Southwest and such. So there's essentially a split in terms of public opinion, but also policy opinion. And we kind of see it mostly because the social stratification of the United States, so in terms of socioeconomics, in terms of poverty rates, and especially in terms of COVID more recently, I mean, minority populations in the US are dying at a much higher proportional rate versus white Americans. So like the most recent statistics is there's 166 deaths of Black Americans versus 116 deaths of white Americans per 100,000 people. So like the systemic differences and the different responses that we see to societal issues is a huge issue, not only for the continuing democracy of the United States, but also for the human rights of the country more generally. I mean, it's something that BLM kind of touches on versus the Capitol riots, and the participants of the Capitol riots kind of go against. So there's kind of two sides to the same coin in terms of, in America, people who basically believe in, you know, working towards things like the SDGs versus people who believe in more archaic qualities of human social stratification. And also, just to note, there's also a huge difference in terms of policy response on the federal level versus the communal level. So BLM is really a communal movement. It's about community. It's about focusing on those around you and trying to build a more equal society, whether that be socioeconomically or, you know, education or things like that, versus the Capitol riots were in a response to a more federal issue, you know, about who's going to be the president, about who is making the laws. So the differences in their goals kind of illustrate a difference in their policy outcomes, as there's less federal attention to trying to create sustainable outcomes of equality that would come from BLM, versus the federal response, obviously, to the Capitol riots. So we have the, you know, Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, but we also have, you know, specifically at least the majority of congressional leaders condemning the riots, but also not exactly making any attempts to change anything. So it's a difference in terms of how people view their rights, as in terms of under the umbrella of federal protection, or if it's a communal issue. And also there's indifference on both issues from people who actually would be able to make policies to make a difference. So this is one resource that I always try and recommend to people. This is David Newitt's book, Alt-America, which highlights the history of basically alt-right nationalism in the United States. It's a hugely beneficial read, I feel like, if you are interested in specifically like social domestic politics of the United States. So this book specifically is something that I think is also specifically poignant to the times. This covers up to the election of Donald Trump. So it doesn't actually cover any of the recent events or events under his presidency. I think it goes into about the first 1 or 2 years of his presidency. But it ends about 2016.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes? Or?
2.
Okay. So I chose to put this book here to basically highlight that there's a huge history between, you know, white nationalism and more equality-based minority movements. And this is not only just, you know, historic in terms of colonialism, in terms of slavery, in terms of colonization, but it's also historic, you know, in the contemporary time with neocolonialism, the new Jim Crow. Like, we have a lot of other social issues that are affecting and degrading human rights in the same way. Like, socioeconomics between Black Americans and white Americans are still extremely stratified, despite different attempts to possibly like help or eradicate poverty. And the systemic racism that is prevalent in the country results in these different outcomes that we see from things like the Capitol riots versus the BLM movement, in terms of how individual Americans respond, but also how, you know, political leaders respond. And it's the newer generation, for example, like AOC, who's tackling more of the issues that we see brought up by the BLM movement, versus kind of the later generation who still stands by the stratification that we see in the ideology of white nationalists. So yeah, those are my sources, and that's about all I have to say. So.
Okay, thank you so much, Avery, and thank you so much, Chinenye. Those were 2 great thought-provoking presentations, and I will now open the floor now for questions. Just like before, you can either send your questions as chat, or you can ask directly. You can unmute yourself and ask directly. So the floor is now open. Anybody can start.
I can start.
Okay, yeah, Corey, go ahead.
So thank you both for your presentations, and my question is directed to Chilenia. When you talk about your recommendation at the end of your presentation about transparency, for example, what would be your suggestion? How can government processes be more transparent? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that's a very important question. I mean, there are many aspects of governmental life where transparency is needed. I give you an example. When it comes to natural resource development, most of the decisions are made internally by the government. Natural resource development affects a lot of people. Let's say mining, for instance. It has a lot of negative impact on local communities. I think it is not proper for the government to award mineral licenses without consultation with the people who are going to be affected by the mining activities. So when I talk about transparency, those are some of the things that I talk about. I'm talking about. The government needs to be transparent. Tell the public, especially the potentially affected public, what they're about to do. Explain to them the impact, the likely impact of the activities on them, and discuss with them to generate ideas on how to address some of those negative impacts, whether to prevent them or to mitigate their impacts. So that's the kind of transparency I mean. The other aspect has to do with government spending. A lot of governments in developing countries, they get a lot of development assistance, whether from the World Bank, from the IMF, or from other countries. They need to be transparent about how the money is spent. Publish the records, let the public see where the money is going, what they are using it for. These things are important for the achievement of the sustainable development goals, because transparency attracts public confidence in the government, and that confidence is important, not only for the achievement of the specific sustainable development goals, but also for national cohesion. It has to be, a government should carry the people along, and that's what involves letting them know what is being done, how decisions are made, and as well as the impact of those decisions. I don't know whether that covers your question.
Okay, she seems quite satisfied. Any follow-up or other questions?
Yeah, could I ask a question for Avery?
Okay, hello, yeah, John, go ahead. Avery, it's on you.
So I had two questions for you. You know, it was interesting this summer where there was certainly some resistance and violence faced by Black Lives Matter protesters, but it was definitely less than, you know, previous years. And one thing that was very interesting and controversial was when police actually marched with or stood with the Black Lives Matter protesters. And I wondered what you thought about that, whether, you know, you saw this maybe as a positive thing, or, you know, as some people pointed out, as a co-option of, you know, of the very powerful movement. And then also as a kind of a follow-up, I wondered what you thought about the possibility of the Federal Commission looking into the insurgency of the Capitol, and whether you think that that's going to succeed in a way to bring some accountability for all the things that you mentioned earlier. So thank you.
Yeah, I guess, so the first question for the police, like marching with BLM protesters, I think that, so, you know, a lot of times this summer on social media, one of the hashtags going around was ACAB, so in all caps are bastards. I think that, because there was a lot of backlash to that specifically, saying like, it's kind of like when women say something about men and then men are like, well, not all men. A lot of people are going on about how it's not all cops, you know, my dad's a cop and he doesn't want to kill Black people. And I think it's a bigger issue than just the individual level, because especially when we look at the death of George Floyd, one of the officers was an Asian American. So it's not just about the white supremacy of cops. It's also a larger issue that kind of has historical context in terms of the police institution. So I don't think that ACAB is necessarily a kind of criticism of individual police officers. It's more of a criticism of individuals who choose to partake in that particular institution. So while it's not all cops necessarily, it's the institution that kind of creates the societal kind of tension. And what BLM is asking isn't necessarily for, cops to be kinder or for cops to, individually do something different. It's also an ask for the institution to change. So while obviously police officers should be better trained in, de-escalation, they should be better trained in, tense situations, they should be better trained in how to use their weapon. There's also the issue of the institution itself shouldn't have so many, weaponized members of communities essentially being watchdogs. So I think when the police, some police officers, obviously did march with the protesters, because I do think that obviously some individuals do agree with the idea that, Black Lives Matter, it's important to acknowledge what your job is perpetrating against these people. But I think it's also the larger issue, especially directed at the police officer, the other police officers that were there at the death of George Floyd. It's the fact that as an individual, there's no standing up to the institution. And on the institutional level, there's no, what's the word? Like self-awareness or, attempt to change. So while police obviously are able to sympathize with the movement, I think that it's difficult in terms of society agreeing that cops are suddenly good because they do kind of a provisional act, which is obviously caught on camera. And then I guess in terms of like the consequences, so like the federal commission and such, I don't think that the current government has a very great track record with the recent acquittal of Donald Trump. I don't think that there's a lot of accountability currently in the government, even with the changeover of the administration. Obviously on the executive level, that's great, but I don't think that necessarily the halls of Congress have changed that much in terms of sympathizing more with societal and systemic change. And I think that's because it obviously directly opposes the values that they've kind of built their careers on. So I think that it's a more long-term change in terms of the general direction. So like, if there was actually any institutional change, for police, and if there's any actual institutional change for, the personal accountability of the ideology that's being purported through, members of Congress and such. So I hope that answered the question.
Okay. John, are you clarified or any follow-up? Okay, good. Your microphone was still mute, but I suppose you meant that answered it. So any other question for Chilenye or for Avery?
I can go.
Yes, okay.
I have a question for both. For Chilenye first. One of the most countries, one of the main reasons COVID had hit so hard has been around the years of austerity, right, and privatization, and how people have been more impoverished, right, and poverty. And I've been concerned listening government so worried about serving the economy, right? We need to save the economy instead of we need to save the people. Any reflection around that, around what we need to save? What is in the sustainability goals? What would be good, good path the government should focus on around how to resolve this? Because I'm worried about saying too much. We need to save the economy. For Avery, the question is, from the people from the outside, sometimes surprised that U.S. has been so difficult for the people seeing that they have a structural racism issue, that they are a racist country, not they have like racist people, is that U.S. is racist. And I think that George Floyd case was like a wake-up call for a lot of people, like, wait, whoa. It seems that we have a bigger issue, more structural systemic racism issue, instead of like we have a few people that are racist. So a reflection, do you also think that conversation has been like going that pathway of like more people being aware, like we need to deal with this structural racism in our institutions, instead of like in the past it was like we have a few bad apples, and also if you think it was connected to George Floyd or other things. That's it for both. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go first because you asked mine first. Yeah, I think all of us have been observing the debates around addressing the pandemic. And there seems to be a tension between addressing the pandemic directly and also addressing the economic impact of the pandemic. I think, in my opinion, I think both should go together, because the economic impacts of the pandemic also have health consequences. So I'm not sure that it's an either-or issue. However, we should also understand that compromises have to be made. Compromises between the economic aspects and the health aspects need to be made. And I don't have an absolute solution to that, but in my opinion, we cannot completely ignore one aspect. We should listen to everyone. People have lost their jobs, that's a fact. And we know that a lot of people also have health challenges that require them to go out. Those health challenges, they can better handle them when they are able to move freely. I have young kids who are at home. I know how they feel. Those who have lost their jobs, they need to get their jobs back in order to be healthy. They need money to buy the food. How much the government giving them? Except a few countries, maybe Canada and some Scandinavian countries, where the governments have given something substantial. For most other countries, how much is $400 a day, a month? It doesn't go anywhere. So in my opinion, we should not make it an either-or issue. Both of them have to go together. There is no need for extreme measures. We don't know much about the virus. The level of knowledge available is still quite low. And so adopting extreme measures, in my opinion, may not be the best way to approach it, because those extreme measures have a lot of economic impacts that come back to feed the health issues again. So I think listen to all the warring factions. I call them warring factions, especially based on what we get from the US, where it has become an ideological issue, a purely political issue. It's now a political tool in the hands of both parties, not just in the hands of one or the other. I think that's the wrong way to approach it.
And Avery, you also had questions.
So I guess in terms of, the response to BLM and stuff, in terms of like the country realizing that it's, obviously systemically racist, I think that it's definitely been, I think, a wake-up call, because I think also, though, it's kind of the same issue that we have with ACAB. So not all men, not all cops, not all white people. And it kind of misses the point in terms of, this issue is larger than just, white people's feelings. Like when someone tells someone else that something they do is racist or something they think is racist, the first response of someone, especially, a white person, is usually to react viscerally, like, I'm not racist, like, I do this, blah, 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 blah. But it's something that I think people need to realize is larger than just themselves. Also being from the South, I'm from Virginia, there's a lot of, Civil War era statues. There's a lot of history that we're taught, especially about the native population or slavery, that isn't is basically just historical propaganda. And I think that it's been a good wake-up call for the country as a whole versus also on the individual level to kind of get this wake-up call. I think it's still a very slow march on the road to progress, on the road to, you know, equality and human rights, especially because I think that a lot of people, and especially a lot of white Americans, are still struggling with the concept of like being part of a system, if that makes sense. Like, I think that a lot of individual white Americans don't necessarily see themselves as the problem. And like Chilene said, it has become such a political issue. People think that it's up to, you know, political leaders to, you know, fix racism. You know, racism's illegal, so therefore there's no racism. Like, it's actually disturbing how many people genuinely think that. But I think it's more of a problem of being able to recognize oneself as part of a larger issue, and how on the individual level we have to also enact change. Because, you know, human rights and equality and treating other people like human beings isn't a political issue. It's a societal issue. It transcends politics. It transcends, you know, class, race. And I think that that's something that a lot of Americans haven't really been able to figure out. And I think it's also because when you start thinking about the systemic racism of the country, then you have to start also considering, you know, also the external effects of what America has been projecting onto the world. So U.S. hegemony, you know, for the past decades has been projecting this, you know, essentially white supremacist ideology through neocolonial means. As, you know, Pablo, you mentioned about Puerto Rico, it's a much larger issue than just the United States because of basically like what the US has been exporting in terms of ideology.
Okay, thank you. So
that it's also seen here in the UK, because it has this issue, which I think is a really interesting point. So.
Okay.
okay.
I mean,
Yeah, is everybody online again?
Okay, maybe I had some question or comment for you, Avery, if that is fine. Then we can see, I mean.
Just a second.
Okay.
I mean, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can everybody see me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just seeing a question on the chat for me.
Yeah, yes, there's a question on the chat for you, yes.
Let me see if I can answer it before I check out. It says, what are the official comments for the fact that the goals of 2015 will not be met in 2030, and on the fact that the standards to be met by 2030 fell so dramatically? Is there any problematic identified? Thank you so much. Well, one of the major reasons they have said that the goals will not be met is because of the pandemic, because it has set a lot of things back. The world was on track to achieve considerably the goals, but these are goals that are hardly ever achieved within the time frame. It's not uncommon, it's not unusual. I don't think there's any part problematic about the SDGs that make them unachievable. But historically, I think it's been the fact that these goals are never fully met, but substantial progress is always made. And substantial progress was being made until the pandemic struck and everything had to come to a standstill. So that is the way I would like to respond to the question. The main problematic is the pandemic. I don't think it's anything inherent in the goals. Of course, there are always obstacles. There are other challenges that are identified. COVID-19 is not the only problem. And there were other problems, but those problems were not insurmountable. Efforts were being made to handle them, adapt to the needs of the time. Financing, for instance, has been a major challenge, but the COVID has also drained the wallet of many countries. So the amount of financial contributions they expected to make, they may no longer be able to make because they had to address the emergency created by the pandemic. So that to me is how I would respond to that. And I hope it goes a long way to provide some clarity around the question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Just for the information, this event is being recorded. I kind of lost my connection a little bit. I hope it doesn't affect the recording. And I will share the recording with all the presenters. I understand that you have to leave soon.
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll leave you exit while we move to the next panel. But thank you so much for your wonderful contributions already so thus far. Lots of.
Thank you very much, and continue. And maybe I will have a chat with Amin later to find out how. Thank you.
Yes. Very good. Very good. Yes. So it's been lots of thought-provoking presentations, and it will continue on the same pattern. We go now to the last panel, and that is the World Systems, Indigenous Peoples Law and Development Enforcement. And we will go first to Ms. Corina Kasi, who is a doctoral candidate in environmental ethics at the University of Helsinki. So Corina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Can you now see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Amin, for inviting me and for organizing this seminar, which so far has been very interesting. My name is Corina Kasi, and today I'm going to talk to challenge a bit the universality of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in order to do that, I am going to present some case studies concerning environmental projects in indigenous Sami land. So it was very good to have the presentation before mine of Chilenian, because he really explained extensively about the Sustainable Development Goal. But here, just a few more information. So the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were written in a document which is called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It was adopted in 2015, and we have 15 years in order to meet these goals. Some of the goals of this document are eradicating poverty in all forms, achieve gender equality, and this is also seek to realize human rights for all. And also there is this universal element, which is in 4 parts, but the part that I'm going to focus on is the one of, according to this document, they want to leave no one behind. The human rights, of course, are essential in order to achieve sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals. They are supposed to be universal because, of course, if there are no human rights for all on an equal basis across the world, we cannot foster universal and thus global solution for sustainability and to sustain the world. At the same time, we have been witnessing conflict between human rights goals and also the Sustainable Development Goals. Some examples are in some minority groups and some indigenous groups, and my example are going to be from the indigenous community. Some scholars blame Agenda 2030, so this document where the Sustainable Development Goals are written, for not challenging the power structures and the dominant actors such as big countries, international financial institutions, transnational corporations, and also international NGOs. And those are responsible of producing and especially of reproducing inequalities concerning income, wealth, and power at the local and also at the global level. And those actors, those big dominant actors, they are causing the very problems that the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to solve. So this is a kind of contradiction. Within this panorama, the local people does not have enough recognition. So they have no voice or very limited voice and no agency. Especially in the current thinking about sustainability and particularly those in the global south. But so are these Sustainable Development Goals really universal? Due to the inadequacy of existing international governance tool and power structure, Sustainable Development Goals are not really universal. Here, I want to be precise and highlight the fact that universality is a wonderful goal, but the way it has been implemented so far within the scheme of the Sustainable Development Goals, this is something that I want to challenge. And for example, when we talk about fostering sustainability, whose sustainability are we fostering when, for example, we prohibit some indigenous people from fishing in the rivers? And this is within the issue of the salmon quota that basically wants to introduced a certain amount of salmon that Sami people can fish. And within some Sami communities, salmon fishing is one of their main livelihood practices. So, again, I want to challenge this universality of Sustainable Development Goals, but how and why I'm going to do that? I'm going to do that from the point of view of presenting the importance of different knowledges. My background is in philosophy, in ethics, and especially environmental ethics. And within this field, epistemology, it's a discipline that comes from a Greek word, episteme, which means knowledge. And epistemology refers to the idea of what we can know about the world and how we can know about the world. So, for example, there are various ideas about what are the criteria of knowledge, how knowledge can be obtained, what are the legitimate source of knowledge, and how the truth can be accessed, how it can be validated and justified. So, for example, through scientific knowledge. But what is important to know is that all knowledge is culturally constructed. Are all knowledges equal? And actually, I want to try to reply to this question via a quote taken by a book, The Animal Farm, written by George Orwell, that goes as follows. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And you see here that I underlined in red the word animals. And if we try to substitute with the word knowledge or scientific knowledge, so for example, all the knowledges are equal, but some knowledges are more equal than others. And that is exactly my point, that there are different types of knowledges that there are not all equal. So, for example, in the Western academia, the hegemonic idea of knowledge has been set, and they have been based on a binary thinking that comes from Enlightenment. From binary thinking, I'm referring to binary concepts such as nature, culture, body, mind, male, female, and those have become some cornerstone of Western dominant thinking. There has been criticism about that. So, for example, Gurminder Brahmbra suggests that this approach highlights that this practice is rooted in colonialism and does not position all knowledges as equal and as having equal value on the global academic spaces. So, alternative knowledges, for example, could be this traditional ecological knowledge. So the idea is that next to the scientific knowledge, there are many other knowledges that can be complementary to it. And an example is this traditional ecological knowledge, which I define together with other two scholars, with Hanna Guttorm, which is a Sami postdoctoral scholar here at Helsinki University, and Kristina Virtanen, Pirjo Virtanen, which is Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies. And we define traditional ecological knowledges as the body of knowledge, practices, and ideas transmitted and generated and regenerated orally and non-verbally in various forms from generation to generation. So there is this intergenerational aspect that are transmitted from past generation to the present to the future generations. For example, in some indigenous community, they consider other than human actors as subject with their own knowing and sentience capability. And human being can learn also from, for example, animal or from force of nature and from the environment at large. I'm going now to focus on some case studies, some examples from some indigenous people, which is the only indigenous people, are the only indigenous people officially recognized in Europe, and about their land, which is called Sapmi or Sami land. You can see, for example, the red and the blue in the pictures, and you can see that they are different, that they are not the same. And that is because officially Sapmi, it is recognized, but the border has not been set because it's a region that is crossing different countries, such as Norway, Sweden, Finland, and northwest of Russia. These are some pictures from Sami people. Sami people are divided in different communities, and different communities have different colors in their dresses, as you can see here. So the main traditional livelihood of Sami people is reindeer herding and some salmon fishing, and that depends where those communities are located. So, for example, if they are close to water bodies such as sea or rivers or lakes, they would concentrate more on salmon fishing, other on reindeer herding. And Sami livelihood practices are defined as the survival capacity of people using the local resources that the natural and the social environment offer. These livelihood practices for Sami people are a mean of subsistence, but they also form their identity as indigenous people, so that they are strongly connected. And they are based on the balance between society and nature. So, for example, a polluted environment is really, it does not foster, Sami people to live according to their traditional practices. In the Sami community, Arbediertu is the Northern Sami word that define the tech, which is the traditional ecological knowledge, which is defined as the collective wisdom and skills of Sami people used to enhance their livelihood for centuries. It has been passed down from generation to generation, both orally and through work and practices and practical experience. It is a way of knowing, understood as a situated process. So is a knowledge which is situated in a particular environment, which is the natural environment surrounding the Sami people community. Traditional ecological knowledge offer information about the physical, biological, and social feature of a specific place, and concern local ecosystem as well as plants, animals, and the sustainable management system.
2 more minutes.
Great, because I'm going toward the end of my presentation, so thank you, Amin. So there are two case studies. One is the case of the Arctic Railway. So the tradition of reindeer husbandry or reindeer herding, which is the same, has been in danger within the Sami community. There are different reasons. Some of the reasons are connected to the deteriorating of the grazing land and lichens pasture. Lichens are the main food for reindeer. And this is due to different form of land use, for example, forestry, especially clear cutting of the old growth forest, which are especially rich in lichens due to tourism, hydropower generation, mining, and wind power, etc. And then there is the construction of this, the project of the construction of this Arctic Railway that should start between from here, from Rovaniemi up until Kirkenes, which is up there. And this will be very negative. It will impact negatively Sami people because it will disrupt, it will cut the traditional migratory reindeer path of Sami, of the reindeer by the Sami people. Up on the right, we have a poster by a Sami activist group, which says, we do not have a plan B, meaning that this is how they live. This is their only way, traditional way of living. And my second example is from wind power in Sami land, but this time in Sweden, so in the north of Sweden. As we know, wind power is very important for renewable energy production. And it is also associated with one of the main sustainable development goals, which is try to reach zero CO2 emission. Many wind farms in Sweden are located in Sapmi, which by law is defined as the Sami indigenous people land, where they herd their reindeers. And there has been many conflicts between the state, the wind companies, and the reindeer herders. Windmill park impact reindeers and also disrupt the migratory reindeer path. So my question is it fair to ask Sami people to make space for energy project to produce close to zero carbon energy, where on the other side, it really impacts their only and main livelihood practice? And of course, my answer is no, it's not fair. This is also another screenshot from an article by The Guardian with the title, Sami reindeer herders file a lawsuit against Norway wind farm. And this is from 18th of January this year. And the article talks about the fact that they want to build new wind power windmill in Norway, exactly in Sami land. So this is not happening only in Sweden, but as well in Norway. So to conclude my presentation, I just want to say that it is important to strive for universality, especially connected to sustainability, but also important to have a critical view on the universality which is mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goal, because so far has not been inclusive. And this is due to the fact that non-mainstream knowledges are not included. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corey. Wow, lots of information, I mean, to compact today. And so we have kept the momentum alive, and we're very thankful. So we will move to the next speaker on the same panel, and that's John Hodge, and he's the former director of research at the Stockton Center for the Study of International Law, U.S. Naval War College. And he will be discussing the politics of poverty, law, and development. So, John Hodge, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Amin.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, so hello to everyone. So Amin asked me to look at a specific article from the Nigerian scholar and jurist, Mr. Gunnarai Udumbana. And it's interesting because I looked at the Third World and the Right to Development, and it was published in 2000. So it was kind of taking a look at how how the right to development had evolved to that point and kind of setting the agenda for the next millennium. And it's very interesting now to look back at, it's already been 21 years, and to see, you know, what the issues were then and how close they have been to being met. And it was very eerie in some ways to see some of the parallels that are still raised today and are still unaccounted for. So he begins by describing a global society set by walls, what he calls walls of power and poverty that deprive people of their basic rights. And then after looking at the legal evolution of the term, urges people within the third world, or perhaps I would say the global south, to redefine the right to development on its own terms. So he notes the first use of the term occurred all the way back in 1955 and contrasted developed economies with that of the underdeveloped. And at the time, if you think of the historical context, it was the capitalist and communist, control-driven economies with that of, the non-aligned states. So you had this geographic issue of the South, and then also kind of a geopolitical issue, which I thought was interesting. And, of course, he looks at development as the individual and then for the group, and strikes a, what we can kind of think of as a familiar point now of economic growth is necessary for development, but of course it can't be the only consideration. And not coincidentally, he also notes the surplus of capital and professional the global north has to act on something. And what is that it acts on? Object relationship. And he ultimately kind of comes idea of striving for flourishing. Just then on quickly to the legal history. This term.
Sorry, John. Sorry to interrupt. Are you hearing a noise? Because
Yes.
I hear a noise that is bothering. Do you know how we could solve that? I mean, because I'm not hearing John very well.
Yes. I noticed the same problem. I think it's with the connection. John, your connection, I don't know.
Let me see. Is that better?
Yes, much better now.
I'll try to stay a little closer to my laptop. Thank you for letting me know, though.
Yes. So if you can go back maybe like 2 minutes of talking time, because it was shaky.
Okay. So let's see. Maybe I'm just going to move on to the legal history of the term, and then I think whatever you missed we can pick up and in the rest of the discussion. Yes. So after some early attempts to define the term, the concept really emerges in the 80s. So in 1981, the International Commission of Jurists defines the right to development as the right of people all over the world and of every citizen to enjoy all human rights. It's interesting to me, this is the same year that the African Charter of Human and People's Rights first comes on board, although it's not, doesn't enter into force for another 5 years. And then a few years later, in 1986, the UN General Assembly adopts the Declaration on the Right to Development. And the most important contribution here is to make clear that human beings and not economic indicators was the primary driving force of economic activity. So the Global Consultation on the Right to Development as a Human Right follows in 1990, and then the Vienna Declaration of the Program of Action in 1993, which reaffirms the right to development as a universal and inalienable right. And then most importantly, maybe also makes clear that it is includes the right of self-determination, which is of course mentioned in Article 1 of both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So then moving towards this redefinition of the right to development from the third world perspective, Udambana suggests the term inward and has a very nice quote from Franz Fanon about not paying tribute to Europe. So he says, let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating states and societies which drew their inspiration from her. If we wish to live up to our people's expectations, we must seek expertise from elsewhere than in Europe. And then he looks to the major challenges, which we've already mentioned on some today, of corruption. And he looks to some of the most famous examples in the African context at that time, President Mobutu of Zaire, which is now the DRC, and also of Sani Abacha of Nigeria, who stole vast amounts of national wealth from these countries with an underdevelopment in them as a result. So he also looks to free trade as both a problem and a solution, noting that it is necessary for economic development, then also how stacked it is against the developing countries. So his recommendations are to eliminate tariffs and quotas, treat corruption as a crime against humanity, which I thought was interesting, and make aid conditional on human rights. And when a country would fail to meet these obligations, he advocated for, instead of giving aid directly to the government, then moving it directly to non-governmental organizations within that country. So that's kind of his perspective. I think it's very interesting, now moving on to the discussion part of this. This article is from 2000. I think it really tracks with Amartya Sen's idea of development of freedom, which was only a year or two before that. Freedom is the autonomy to choose, but also is a responsibility to follow the rule of law and let others choose freely as well. Which to me then brings up the question of, well, how much choice is really available for those in the global south, both then and now, especially with international debt and some of the legal tools, I call them, of economic coercion. And so I have an example of a country that I do a lot of work on, which is Sudan. So in April 2019, after 30 years of authoritarian rule, the people of Sudan were able to push out Omar Bashir, who had ruled the country in autocracy for 3 decades. But there's still sanctions from the US and the UN, and Sudan is still on the state sponsor of terrorism list in the US, which means that it can't access IMF relief for highly indebted poor countries. And it's only after it makes some political promises that then have legal effect, such as taking responsibility for a terrorist attack on the USS Cole in 2000 and agreeing to normalize relationships with Israel, that it's then allowed to have this legal effect of being removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list, and then allowed to start the process for debt relief. So debt is crippling Sudan's economy. And then another one that is more recent, with the new Biden administration, the US just announced that it would rejoin the UN Human Rights Council. But the next day, it also announced it would sell $200 million worth of weapons to Egypt, despite its human rights record and the authoritarian government there. So I think, these actions aren't illegal per se, but they certainly undermine, the people's right to self-determination in these states. And you could also argue that they even would go so far as to threaten individual rights, such as the right to freedom of expression, right to life, and right to an adequate standard of living. And again, they really, to me, raise difficult questions about how meaningful choice is within the global south. And I think they also demonstrate a larger line drawing exercise. So reparations for colonial imperial harm, though freely admitted and undeniably catastrophic, are always considered too far removed from the proximate cause to incur legal responsibility. It's just outside the realm of possibility for the global north. But then you look at the example of Sudan, where people suffered under this authoritarian government for 30 years. Many of them lost their lives pushing him out of power, and they're still paying this responsibility for his actions at the time. And I think climate, to me, is probably the most striking example, where the third world or the global south has contributed the least and still remains the most affected and the most vulnerable to global warming. and the global north still continues to admit loss and damage within legal forums or to accept liability or compensation for climate change. So this is true even though it's the direct results of the exploitative capitalist model, that occurred during especially colonialism and imperialism and continues today, where extractive colonial governance was, largely responsible for, a lot of the global warming that occurred during the Industrial Revolution and continues. So just to wrap up then quickly, the need for the Global South to chart its own path is still desperately needed, but it's still, to me, even more difficult now than 20 years ago, given the interconnections of the global economy, which I think we touched on in some earlier presentations, and also just the interconnectedness of international relations as well. So even though the need for assertiveness and to reclaim policy space for the Global South is clear, I think it is more difficult than ever to think about how this would be realized and how to achieve just economic policies and even a greater humility from the global north. So thank you.
Amin, you're mute.
Amin, your microphone.
Sorry, my microphone was mute. I was saying thank you so much, John, also for another thought-provoking presentation. The momentum is alive. So we'll have one more presentation under this panel before you get your questions. I know there are a lot of questions for all of you. We have Dr. Babila Sama. He's with a postdoctoral candidate at a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki in the Faculty of Social Science. But right now he was speaking from Cameroon. He's based in Cameroon. He was speaking from Cameroon at the moment, and he's presenting on overcoming poverty in Cameroon, current economic development prospects. So Dr. Babila Sama, the floor is yours, and I would appreciate if you tell us something about your environment where you are at the moment, and then you can zoom to your presentation. So you're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, the host. So can you hear me? Can everyone hear me very well?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So greetings from Cameroon.
If you can draw your, yes, exactly, because we're not seeing you. Yes, very good.
Yeah, so greetings from Cameroon with the beautiful sunshine, as you can see. I'm using my phone to make this presentation. So I'm going to talk about overcoming poverty in Cameroon, current economic development prospects. So I have listened to some of the previous lectures which relate to what I'm going to say, especially the one on Puerto Rico, which has to do with colonization of Puerto Rico, that was presented by Pablo, and also the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So as you very well know, Cameroon is a developing country in Central Africa, bordering Nigeria, and Nigeria, which is the most populous country in Africa with a population of 200 million people. So Cameroon has a population of about 25 million people as of 2019. And Cameroon got independence from France and Britain in 1960. So Cameroon is a relatively very young independent country. So as a developing country, Cameroon has a lot of problems regarding development, and the poverty rate here is relatively high in Cameroon. As you know, Cameroon, as a former colonial country, suffers from neocolonialism from France and from the UK, from Britain. These two countries that colonized Cameroon, because in Cameroon we have this French-speaking Cameroonians in the east and the English-speaking Cameroonians in the south. So Cameroon is a bilingual country of French and English regions. So unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to make an oral presentation. So regarding the poverty situation in Cameroon, one thing to note is that the economy of Cameroon is very, very informal. So many Cameroonians trade in the informal sector where they sell little things in order to make living. So living basically here is like survival of the fittest, where you do whatever kind of activity that can give you a living. So the government has really been struggling to see how to get many Cameroonians into like the formal economy, into paid jobs, and into some sort of training, professional training. But however, the challenge is that the education system is very, very academic. So many students study academic subjects like history, geography, and literature, which is not very professional in nature. So, but now there is a government policy to try to give more vocational training to Cameroonians, especially to the young generation. And as you know, with the coming of technology, the coming of the internet, ICT, digitalization, many young Cameroonians are trying to get into startups and into digital business, into online business, and into different kinds of technological activities that can enable them to get employment in the formal sector and to upgrade the economy of the country and the development of the country through technology. So Cameroon has many development organizations like the United Nations World Food Program, United Nations, different kinds of international organizations that works in collaboration with the government to enhance the development of the country, enhance the economy. So poverty in Cameroon is quite high. We have a high rate of poverty here in the country, as I told you, because there is no social security, like social welfare in the country. So Cameroonians don't receive any social benefits, any benefits from the state, as we see in welfare states like Finland. So families usually depend on each other. It's a kind of a communal system we have here where family members depend on each other. So if you come from a very poor family where all the members do not have income or enough resources, then you find yourself in poverty. And then the government has been making a lot of progress to lift many Cameroonians in poverty situation, but this has been compromised recently since 2016 by an ongoing crisis which we have in the country, political crisis which we have in the country, because there is some kind of insurrection or fighting going on in three regions in the country: the English-speaking region, and the northern part of the country. And the northern part of the country, we have Boko Haram, which is a terrorist organization fighting there, and so the government is putting a lot of resources in this fight that could have been used in the development of the country. So basically, the economy of Cameroon depends predominantly on agriculture. Cameroon produces a lot of cash crops like cocoa, coffee, banana, and some oil, like petroleum products that are exported and which brings in foreign revenue. But due to corruption, the corruption rate here is very high. Many of the programs meant to help the poor don't really trickle down to those really in need. So some of the money is embezzled and mismanagement, and some of those things, some of those kinds of bad governance have really affected efforts meant to accelerate the development of the country and to alleviate poverty among the poorest of the poor. So we still have a situation where the most disadvantaged in the society are like some sort of abandoned to themselves. And very little is done. Very little is is done due to corruption to improve this situation. This is not only the case for Cameroon, but for many sub-Saharan African countries. So many, Nigeria, Ghana, and many sub-Saharan African countries find themselves in this position. The Western countries could have actually played a role through collaboration with Cameroon to improve the development situation of the country. Then most often we see that development aid that is given by Western countries, by the European Union and other Western countries, do not really help in alleviating the poverty. Because if we look back since independence in 1960, that what has development aid done to improve the economy of Cameroon and other sub-Saharan African countries, you'll find that so little, really little has been done. The elites benefit from the system, from the centralized system in Cameroon and many other African countries. And so power and money and everything circulates at the level of at the elitist level. And so people below get just, bits of what trickles down to them. So
2 more minutes.
Okay, 4 minutes. Okay, I think that for this situation to improve, there should be like some sort of devolution of power, decentralization. There should be accountability. There should be accountability in that government should be able to say, there should be accountability and transparency in government revenue and expenditure. And people found corrupt, government officials found corrupt should be tried and imprisoned, and money embezzled should be retrieved and used for development purposes. So without good governance, it will really be very difficult to tackle the poverty and development situation of Cameroon and many sub-Saharan African countries, which I think you know about the problems that these countries face in their development efforts. So giving like aid to these countries by the Western countries is not really the solution, because it is better to buy the raw materials of the developing countries like Cameroon at a reasonable price so that the farmers can get enough money for their resources. Because when the price is very, very low for coffee, cocoa, banana, as it is the case and has been the case for a very long time, farmers who produce these products remain poor. They remain like, they remain forever poor in sub-Saharan Africa. I will give you an example that when it comes to like the transformation of cocoa, the farmer here in Cameroon who produces the cocoa gets less than 5% of the value chain. So the big companies in the West that transform the cocoa and who give the brand names make so much of the money. So I think that there should be fair trade to improve the economic and development of sub-Saharan African countries like Cameroon and other developing countries in the world in order to alleviate the people from poverty, and that Western governments, through collaboration, should assist developing countries like Cameroon in their good governance efforts, so that the issue of corruption, mismanagement of resources, the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency can be dealt with. Thank you very much.
Dr. Babila Sama, and for your insightful presentation, and also for the practical background. Yes. And I will now open the floor. Just stay tuned. I will now open the floor for questions. As before, you can either ask directly or you can write a text. You can write on chat, and then I will transmit that to the presenters. So whoever wants to start, you can go ahead. The floor is now open for questions. And that is to Corina, to John, and to Thomas.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Manuel has a question. Yes.
Yes, first, thanks, Thomas, for, it's so nice to see somebody that is in the streets of Cameroon, actually. So it has been super nice to hear.
Please, can you pick up a little bit? I'm not getting you.
Yeah, my question is for John and Corina. So John, I don't know if I'm right. I think there was a peace agreement between Sudan and Israel recently. And I wanted to ask you if that has changed anything, if you are aware that after that agreement, new possibilities raised, or if it's better for the people. That was my question for you. And the question for Corina is if you have been directly talking to Sami people, and if you have spoken to them, how do they see these issues or something talking to them that has called your attention about how they perceive themselves and the society, and the questions you raised about knowledge and development and their livelihood. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. There has been some change on that. So the deal that happened was, basically the Trump administration really wanted a foreign policy victory before the election. And so they pushed really hard on a few countries to normalize relationships with diplomatic relations with Israel, which otherwise they would not have. And Sudan, as soon as the election, actually even before the election, they started pushing back and saying, we don't necessarily want to do this, but we're kind of being forced to. And so, especially after the election results, they have been very, they've really kind of slowed the whole thing down and, trying to decide if they're still going to do this. But I think the point that demonstrates, though, is, this is something that's affecting poverty of millions of people in Sudan, and it really has nothing to do with the diplomatic relations. It's just that the United States government wanted this to happen for totally different reasons. And I think it shows, just kind of the absurdity of this, right? Where so many people are suffering, and just for this political point that has nothing to do with the average Sudanese person, the country is able to access that relief. So I think that's the biggest takeaway from it is not only just the, on the ground things have changed, but, the whole point of this, supposedly had to do with one thing, but really, the effect is so much worse. And I think that's the point to take away, but thank you. That's a very good question.
Okay. And there was a question for Corina as well.
Thank you, Manuel, for your question. So first of all, my research is not based on interview I'm not an anthropologist, but of course I've been talking to Sami people about this and other issue. First of all, it's not a very easy issue to talk, meaning that you cannot go to Sami people and say, hey, you are Sami, what do you think about that? It's really not that simple. So one way that I found is, for example, that one of the articles that I'm writing with a Sami scholar. So that is, in that case, it's easier to talk about it. And in that article, she is talking about the Sami issue. And that makes it much easier because she's Sami, she knows the language, she knows the issue in the first person. So we're collaborating in this sense. But of course, I've been also talking with Sami people about the issue, and many of them are activists themselves to their cause because there are not so many. So they are all try to do something as much as they can. So, for example, they've been protesting with this. There was the protest of the Red String against the construction of the Arctic Railway. And through media, they always try to raise their voice. They're also a very nice activist it's a Sami group of artists and activists, which is called Suo Pan Terror. And the poster that I show about the Arctic Railway, that we do not have a plan B, that is from them. And with the very provocative poster, they are really visualize the issue. And some of their exhibition has been taking place in Helsinki, in the Kiasma, which is the Contemporary Art Museum, and also at the National Museum. But the works continue. So I'll be happy to talk with more Sami people.
Okay,
Thank you.
I have a question for Thomas. Thomas, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. You're in Cameroon on the ground and everything. So, what do you see the prospects of change, of positive change? I mean, in economic sense, in economic development sense. Let me say in the nearest future. What are the prospects?
Okay, you mean prospects for change among
in the country?
Please take the question again.
Cameroon as a country. I mean,
yes. Okay.
Yes. Your
Okay,
video.
prospects for change.
Yeah, something wrong with your video, but I cannot see, but I can hear the audio, so it's fine.
Yes, I can. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So the prospects for change in Cameroon is that at the moment, people should not rely a lot on the government, because the government has proven that it cannot help the people. So what many Cameroonians are doing today is that they try to get into some economic activity that can enable them to have a living. So when you come to Cameroon, like compared to previously, all Cameroonians are like selling some food stuff, or selling dresses, or maybe selling telephone gadgets, or internet internet connection. Every person is trying to do something. The younger generation, they are trying to get into vocational schools. This changes that. They are trying to get into some sort of vocational training. The government is still to do something about the issue of corruption, mismanagement, and is still to work a lot on social programs that can alleviate the poor from their situation of destitution. So I think that the fight against corruption, improving transparency, improving good governance is really what is going to help a lot in the development of the country, and in getting the poor away from poverty. So, but we have it. I mean, Cameroon has a long way to go in that respect. But like I said, each Cameroonian knows that the government is unable to help the people. So each one is trying to rely on themselves in terms of doing any sort of activity that can help them to have a living.
Okay, thank you very much. So now is the time to ask a question to any other, either to this same panel or any other panel. If there's a question that you had, but you didn't have time, or you forgot, and you have reflected over it, it's time to ask, because we are soon coming. Coming to the end of the workshop, and any question for any other member of the panel.
I can make some questions.
Yes.
So for we're going to be one for each one. For Corina, any reflections around how to prevent benevolent colonialism practice? I feel that sometimes there's a cliche perspective of what is colonialism, and people don't see that also colonialism practice can be behind good intentions. So any reflection on how we can prevent that when we're talking about development and trying to address poverty in marginalized, oppressed community countries. For George, it is, John. The question is around, usually when we talk about poverty and development in globalization, a lot of responsibility for the South, and a lot of usually it's like a lot of things we need to do, but there's a lack of conversation around what is the role and responsibility of the North, because we all know they're interconnected, right? The poverty in this global South have to do with like the global North is there too, in that so it has to be part of it. So any reflections around what is the role of the North in this global poverty and what things they can do? And then for Thomas, the question for Thomas, it is if there's any social or political movement for trying to create like some type of social programs or social welfare in Cameroon, and what are the difficulties of creating a social welfare system in Cameroon? Yeah, that would be it.
Okay, we'll start with Corina.
Pablo, for your question. This is a very good question. I think that first of all, we should all study about colonialism since, elementary school, junior high. What I found, for example, I'm Italian, I'm based in Finland, and I know much more about Sami people than an average Finn. Whether my age, older than me, younger than me, there's really very, very little knowledge. And the same is also for the other countries, like Norway, Sweden, and also Russia. So first of all, I would introduce history of these indigenous people in schools, because they do not know. And then I would start to talk about it, because the way I am, for example, I myself cannot say that I'm clean from benevolent colonialism. And this is, strange, but even though I studied it, sometimes I found myself that I could have said in another way. So, the trial and error, and this, talking with Sami people or with other, people that have been oppressed as a woman, for example, I can talk about it, the gender discrimination. So colonialism in that sense. So my reply is study about the history of indigenous people, of minority in schools, so that everybody will get to know the same stories, the same history, and also trial and error, and talk and say with a person, maybe your attitude is not exactly what you think it is, and because this is how I learn and how I'm learning. Thank you.
Thank you. And to John?
Okay, is it my turn?
No, John. Okay, yeah, you can go ahead then, John. Last, yes.
Okay. So in Cameroon, since independence in 1960, there exists a social welfare institution here in the country, which is mainly for workers in the public sector and workers in the private sector. And these two sectors make less than 20% of the employment in the country, because, as I said, Cameroon has about 80% of its economy. About 80% of the economy of Cameroon is informal. So, if you consider just the 20% who work for the government and the private sector, I mean like big companies, you find that majority, about 80% or so of the population is not covered by any social welfare or social benefit or pension, pension or any kind of insurance coverage. So the government has been trying to make efforts in that direction to increase coverage through encouraging small and medium-sized enterprises, through encouraging cooperatives where farmers and low-income earners can save their money, through microfinancial institutions. But some of these efforts are hampered by corruption and mismanagement, because sometimes the funds in these cooperatives and financial institutions are embezzled. Sometimes the accountability, transparency about how the money is is used or is hard to find. So I think that and also the government is trying to encourage giving out loans at low interest to farmers and to the youth for startups and to people who have some initiatives that can enable them to establish themselves in the private sector. So I think with internet today, internet and technology today, orientation, there is some sort of change taking place in that the youth are trying to be creative, and at the same time, this creativity is making the government to think of better ways by which they can orientate development to meet the needs and the current situation of the world. So yes, we have this welfare being introduced by the government through the social welfare institution that exists. But it could have been very effective if there was no corruption. I mean, you can imagine that a lot of money meant to alleviate poverty is embezzled, and because there's no accountability and transparency, nothing is done to the embezzlers. This is what is really one of the main problems that is driving, or that is reducing or slowing down the progress made in the area of development and the fight against poverty in the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there's John, and then also there's a question for Corona in the chat. But first John, and then after that Corona, and we are almost coming to the end of our time. But first John.
Thank you, Pablo. That's a very good question. I think,
those not talking, can they kindly mute their microphones?
The role of the Global North, of course, it's the reason for much of this, right? If not all of it. The economic divide being so vast, the issues of global warming that we spoke on earlier, that came through the center periphery divide that occurred throughout the colonial and the imperial eras. So I guess the question then is what to do of it now, and how does the North find itself positioned? It still thinks of itself, I think, often, and of course, also we're obviously talking in generalizations about both the North and the South, but the North is still seen as the fix, right? The donor, the development agency that's going to come and act upon rather than work with. And I do think that's changing in, slowly, but in, definitely in some of the humanitarian and NGO organizations, and then slower at the larger, institutional levels of like a USAID or a World Bank. But I think it's just it's up to everyone to, keep that pressure on and remind the North that maybe it has the expertise, but it's also the reason for the situations in the first place. I mean, I think, the more important things you could do that are harder politically are reparations, are a fund, a massive global fund to address climate change, a relief of all the debt, not an IMF restructuring, but just a forgiveness of debt that have brought on often from, governments that were in power for a short time, often not democratically elected, that then, left a huge burden on the next generation. So I think those are some of the big ones, but of course, there's also the possibility for South-South cooperation, right? So I think one thing that was really interesting was the possibility of a free trade zone for all of the African continent as a way to increase trade among countries in the global South, rather than having to deal with global north imports and unfair trade practices in the first place. So those are just some of the things that popped in my mind. But obviously it's a huge question, and I think ultimately it comes down to political will of the those empowered to do the right thing or to be forced to do the right thing. And I think that's where the role of academics and activists to really highlight the reasons for these changes and the necessities of them is the most powerful things that we can do. So thank you. Great question.
Thank you very much. If there is no other question, then I think that may be it in terms of questions. Was there anyone else who has a question for any of the panelists?
I think there was a question for me.
Sorry. There's a question for you. Sorry. Yes.
No problem. I can also be brief, so to leave space also others. So basically, John was asking, and thank you for the question, John. Are there any effort to address the tension between Swedish wind farm and the Sami reindeer herders? So yes, there has been a lot of effort to come to compromises. So for example, one has been the Sami people ask for local consultation. So for example, that any type of project would be consulted with them. There are some representative institutions that are called Sami Parliament. They're not like the parliament, Finnish parliament. They are not like this, but they are anyway institution of Sami people that they represent Sami interest. But of course, because they are not legal entities, it's also a bit tricky because they're not be officially recognized by the state. And of course, there is one Sami parliament in Norway, one in Sweden, which actually is itinerant. So it's not in one place, but they move across the country exactly to address this type of problem easier. And then there is a Finnish Sami parliament. There is also another issue that unfortunately within Sami community, Sami are divided because there are those Sami that they want this kind of project to come to their land in order to, because even, some Sami people, for example, in mining, that's really, really contested issue, even more than the wind farm. Because some Sami people can work in the minings and get some money, but of course, on the other hand, the Sami that are still living in traditional way of living, they are very negatively affected. There has been some attempt. So, for example, even in Finland, when they built street, like very kind of highway, they had built some kind of corridor on top of the highway where the animal and the reindeer can pass so that, they don't cross the street, but actually they pass through these kind of bridges. So there are some attempts. Of course, the power imbalance is still big, meaning that the nation state have the last word, let's say, the last saying. But some people have really an attitude of let's come to an agreement. We have to somehow get to a compromise. We are living together. But of course, there are also some Sami people that are really highly activist and really still fighting. So very different perspective, let's say. Thank you. And Amin, there was a question for you.
Yes, I did answer in the message. So yes, I was supposed to talk about pandemics, global poverty, human rights, and development in the 21st century. Yeah, but because one professor who was supposed to do the moderation that I'm doing now could not make it, I decided to stand by. But luckily, Dr. Sama Babila, he stepped in to give, because I invited him like quite late to give a presentation today. I'm very thankful. But I plan to organize another workshop like this, probably in May. And I would like to invite all of you again. And hopefully, this is my first time organizing something of this nature. And I'm very, even though we have come today, and I'm very impressed. I mean, I was expecting more people to show up, but we have had 26 people signing up today at one point or another. I know there's pandemic, people have their jobs, families. So some could not stay for that long, and some signed in just for some panels. And I'm so thankful. It's been so rich. It's actually exceeded my expectations. The density and the quality of the presentations. It's been really, really beautiful. We have had people signing in from places like China, Cameroon, US, UK, Finland, and everywhere in between. So it's so beautiful. So every continent actually, in spite of every continent except Australia. So that's quite impressive. And Puerto Rico, let me not forget Puerto Rico. So, yeah, and I'm so thankful. And before we come to an end, I would like anyone to say maybe one last thing. If you have something to say to everyone, to the whole audience, that would be very appreciative. And again, like I said before, the event is being recorded, and I will share with all the panelists. So if anyone has something to say to everyone, then this is your time, maybe to bid farewell to everybody and everything.
I want to thank everybody, and especially Amin, for organizing. It has been great to be invited to speak, and also to share my thought, but also that to be part of this lively conversation. So thank you, Amin, for organizing it.
I really appreciate. My pleasure. Yes. Anyone else? Okay. If not, then we call it wraps. And thank you so much. Have an amazing time, and stay safe. And I will be chatting with you privately. So,
Thanks, Amin.
Yes, thank you.
Everyone.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Amin. Thank you very much.
Yeah, cool.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.